Hey everybody, this is Dan Deppen for cardrunners.com, and I'm excited to be bringing you my first PLO8 video over here at Card Runners. Some of you may have seen my '08 basic series that I did back on stocks, and starting in the first video here, I'm going to be talking about full ring play and specifically pre-flop and flop play, and we'll see how far in this video I actually get into the flop portion of it. This is probably going to be at least 2 videos overall, and in this series I'm going to be going another level or 2 deeper, and we're going to be getting beyond the basics and start to think another level up and do a little more reacting to the players at the table and give you more things to consider when you're making decisions. My first series was sort of the ABCs of PLO8 because prior to myself and Predator and folks coming on over at Stocks Poker, there was really not a lot of material available on PLO8. Now that several months have gone by and that sort of changed a little bit, it's time to start delving a bit deeper. So, full ring pre-flop considerations. What most people do, I don't know if it's most anymore, but what quite a few people do when they're playing full ring as opposed to 6-max is they try to just make the nuts. Wait, play it super tight, make the nuts, and then try to get all their money in. And originally I played this way myself for quite a while, very successfully. And while you can definitely still make money playing that kind of style in full ring, it doesn't work nearly, I don't think it works nearly as well nowadays as it did, say, 2 or 3 years ago. So 2 or 3 years ago there was even more limping and a lot more people playing way too many hands than they should. Nowadays in 2010, people are still looser than they should be, and I would argue that PLO8 is still the softest of the big bet games for sure, and you can still just tighten up and play really nutty hands and try to flop the nuts and then get the money in and show a profit in full ring PLO8. But I don't think it's the best strategy by far. It's definitely low variance, but I think you're giving up quite a bit if you just wait and try to see the nuts. And as time goes on too, and people, as other players get better, the value of that strategy I think is just going to go down and down over time. So here are some sort of better things to be thinking about before the flop in full ring. So I'd argue that instead of having to pedal the nuts, you actually can play a bunch of hands in full ring. I don't argue for going bananas and playing 30+% of hands or anything like that, but you can definitely play 20 to 25% of your hands pre-flop profitably if you're thinking about the right things. So the real key to being able to open up your game in full ring is just recognizing and using your position, and then also just being aware of the different opponents you have to your left and to your right. So position I'm going to talk about more on the next slide, but long story short, when you're in the blinds and when you're in early position, you're going to want to play super tight. And in those positions, you're going to basically be playing that nut pedaling type of style. We're playing very few hands and waiting for premium hands and being careful post flop, since you're almost always going to be out of position. However, where I think a lot of players go wrong by not opening up their game, and where you can open up your game, is in the later positions. And so when you're in the button, the cutoff, and the hijack, you can actually play quite a few hands. So one of the other things we're going to talk about more in this is you do have to be careful about who's on your left. If you have a maniac that's straight on your left, that's either going to be raising you or just calling you like crazy, well then you're not going to be able to play as many hands even though in those late positions, because when that person calls you, now you're going to be at there's more likelihood of the pot ending up multi-way, because if you're in the cutoff and the button calls you, now that not only do you have a player with position on you in the pot, but now it encourages the blinds to call, and now you've got a multi-way pot and you're out of position against one player. So when you have aggressive or very loose players on your left, it's going to diminish your ability to really open up. And opposite of that, if you've got a bunch of rocks on your left, well then you can open a ridiculous amount of hands in your late positions. So, but generally speaking, we're going to be playing, our style of play in the late positions versus the early positions is going to be radically different. And there's going to be more of a difference in how many hands you play than you would have in 6-max. Obviously, you're going to do a similar thing in 6-max. We're going to play tight. In early position, you're going to open it up on the button. But I think in full ring, you're going to be playing even tighter in those early positions. And so you get kind of a wider dispersion of the hands that you're going to be playing. And so other things to consider when we're thinking about coming into a pot or opening a pot is whether we want the pot to be heads up or multi-way. So if there are people that are already in the pot, well then they're generally not folding in PLO 8. So let's say you have one or two players limp and then you raise for full pot. Most of the time those players aren't going anywhere. So if you're on the button or in the cutoff and there's already a few limpers in, you kind of don't have a choice most of the time in whether the pot's going to be heads up or multi-way. It's going to end up multi-way because usually people don't limp fold or raise fold too often pre-flop in PLO 8. They do it some, but in general you can kind of expect them to call. And if they are limp folding, then you really want to attack that and make them pay for doing that, because I think that's a big leak if folks are doing that. However, a lot of times we are able to get the pot heads up, either if it's folded to us and we raise kind of expecting one player to call, or if someone opens in front of us when if we 3-bet, we're generally going to have the pot heads up. And so whether you want to be heads up or multi-way depends on the type of hand that you're holding. So one thing you can do in full ring is, because you do get so many large multi-way pots, you can play some hands that at least have a little bit of nut potential. You can get a really good implied odds if you have a lot of players in the pot with you. And then the last thing we want to think about, not the last thing, but the last bullet on this slide, is considering the stack sizes and how much post-flop play there's going to be. So if you've got very big hands like double suited aces, or double suited aces with a wheel card or something like that, well then if you can get a large portion of your effective stack in, then you want to play a fewer number of streets post flop and make it easier just to get the money in. Whereas if you've got another hand like a say ace 3 with a suit and then some other random side cards where you've got some nut potential but you're not going to hit a whole lot of flops, well then you want a lot of money left behind in the stacks, and so then you're going to want to play you want to have a larger stack to pot ratio, so there's more post flop play, so that the times where you miss the flop and get out cheaply and then have a chance to get paid if you do hit. Because one of the advantages of full ring, because you do get so many multi-way pots, is that when your hands do hit, your implied odds are generally very good, and you've got a much better chance of getting paid off than you do in 6-max, where you tend to be heads up more often than not. So kind of back to my previous point, that's another argument for being able to open up and play more hands. But again, it kind of depends on the table dynamics. If you're in an overly aggressive table, you're not going to be able to do that quite as much. But most tables these days are not super aggressive, and so you can try to see a lot of flops cheaply and then stack somebody. Or even there are times where it's okay to go for half the pot if you're 4 or 5 ways and you've got the nuts in one direction or the other. That can be okay. Generally speaking, we try to scoop, but there are times as you'll see as we get further into this next series, that becomes okay at different points. So talking about position, this is from a session I played the other night. Originally, when I was going to do this video, I was going to do a live play and then just sort of comment on some of the full ring pre-flop concepts, and I realized that it would probably be easier to do a PowerPoint and then go back to replay some of the hands in the replayer so that I could organize the points a little better and try to go about this in a little more logical way. The problem is when you're playing is different opportunities to illustrate different points kind of come up randomly, and it's hard to put together a coherent video, so I kind of scrapped that earlier video and have gone back to this. But these are the stats that I had from that session that I played. And so you can see here in the blinds, I'm playing pretty tight, and then it's opening up a little bit in early position. And this was a 9-handed table. If you notice the way that Holder Manager spits out the stats, I couldn't get it to spit out all 9 positions, so the middle and early positions it kind of lumps. That's why there's like twice as many hands as these others. So this wasn't 6 max, even though it's showing 6 positions. But again, we're playing very tight in the blinds, opening it up a little bit more early, and then as we move towards the button, our range expands pretty widely until I'm up here at 35% of hands on the buttons. And this is, the 35% of hands on the buttons is fairly typical for what I'll do. In 6 max, I'll commonly go over 40%. Over here in the middle, playing 25, that was pretty high. Because when I was playing this, I was intending to originally to just show that for the video, so I was trying to play a few more hands than normal to make the video more interesting. So actually these, I think the cutoff and button positions are probably fairly normal for what I normally do. But the early and middle position stats are actually a little bit on the high side. So, but the key is you want to look and have this nice wide dispersion throughout your positions. And in Hold'em Manager, there's another stat called pre-flop positional awareness, and I recommend you keep an eye on that. Usually when I have sessions that are going awry, I notice that for whatever reason I'm opening too many hands in early position and my pre-flop positional awareness stat gets pretty low. I'm not sure exactly how they calculate that stat, but usually you want to be probably over 3, and sometimes I've had it as high as over 8 or 10 even. And the other thing you can do with Hold'em Manager and looking at these stats is not only do you want to watch your own, but look at some of the other players that you're up against, particularly some of the regulars where you might have a decent sample of hands on. There are many, many regulars that just don't use position at all. Like if you pull up these stats for them, they'll just have the same VPIP and the same pre-flop raise in all the positions, which is, and there are winning players that do that, but in general that's ridiculously bad, and they're giving up quite a bit by doing that. So definitely something you want to keep an eye on, because historically what I used to do was look at people's just overall VPIP and pre-flop raise, and what I found when I started digging a little bit deeper is that just because someone plays, you can have 2 players that play 20-10 pre-flop, and they can be radically different players. And that's really, really important to know, because if someone's doing something like this where they have a nice dispersion and they open in early position, well, that tells you a lot about their hand strength. Whereas, and generally that's what you kind of assume people are doing, but some people aren't at all. So the players that are not varying their play with position, when they open under the gun, if you didn't realize they weren't using position, that under the gun looks really strong, but in reality it may not be at all. And likewise, when those players are opening in late position and the cutoff on the button, generally you assume that people are opening pretty wide, which they should be in those positions. But again, if someone's just sort of playing their cards and not their position, their button opening range might be a whole lot stronger than what you think, and that can get you into trouble if you defend light from the blinds. I think that the advent of rush poker too on full tilt has kind of people get into kind of this robot mode where they're just sort of looking at their starting hands and they're not thinking as much about their position, especially since in rush poker your position changes around hand to hand. It doesn't go in the same flow that it normally does in a ring game. So digging in a little deeper on early position and thinking about what we might want to do. So the first point is limping in early position is not the end of the world. I've talked about this before, but I'll hit it again just because a lot of people have it drilled in their heads from Hold'em that limping is a cardinal sin, and in holding that may be true, but in Omaha games in general it tends not to be, especially in PLO 8 where the hand values are running pretty close. So you can limp quite a few hands from early position, and I would say that probably most of the time we are going to be limping when we come into a pot. So the next point is raising. When we do want to raise an early position, one thing we don't want to just raise all of our aces hands. That's another big leak that a lot of players have, even regulars, is they're playing that tight range in early position, but they're just only raising ace-ace. And that's bad because if you know somebody's doing that, you can just call with, if you get an opportunity to play them heads up in position, you can call them with just about anything. And even though you may be behind as far as preflop equity, if you know what they have, you can play them almost perfectly post-flop. So when we do raise, don't just raise ace-ace XX. A lot of your bad aces, you're probably just going to want to fold, like your ace-ace, 9-7, with no suits and things like that. And your stronger aces, you can open, but then you're going to want to also mix in some other hands, like your ace-deuce with a Broadway card, and then sometimes too you can play some high-only hands for deception, but you don't want to get too carried away with that. And then when we do raise, as far as raise size, a lot of times I just min raise when I come in, and I do that for a couple reasons. One is when you're out of position, you want to play smaller pots. Just like when you're in position, you want to play bigger pots. So by min raising, you do pump the pot up a little bit, but you're not letting the pot size get out of control. The other thing is, a lot of players interpret a raise as a raise, and they don't necessarily treat it as being weaker than if you had raised for full pot. Now, sometimes too, I think people give you even more credit for ace-ace when you raise an early position, because usually that's the only thing they raise with in early position, and so when you do it, they assume that's what you have. And I think sometimes when you min raise, people assume that you're trying to be tricky with aces and like lure people into the pot, and so I think it gives you a little bit of deception value. So most of the time in raising, that doesn't mean you can't raise for full pot, and there are a lot of times where that makes the most sense. But generally though, there's some specific conditions where for the pot size raise, you want the stacks deeper so that you've got better implied odds post flop. So if you're playing, especially now, some of the 200 plus big blind games, that may make more sense to raise for full pot, since you want to start to build more of a pot earlier, since if you hit a flop hard, it's going to take more streets to get your stack in post flop. Or the other thing too is if you're just playing at a table that's very, very, very tight and predictable, where maybe the min raise may not get as many people out, but the pot raise may actually really define people's hands, it may make more sense just to raise for full pot. And then the last situation I want to talk about was blind on blind. A lot of these stats where I'm raising, as I went back and I was looking through the hand history on this, I noticed that most of your raises out of the blinds are when it's blind on blind. And even in full ring, even though it doesn't fold around to the blinds all that often, I mean, it does happen a reasonable bit of the time. And so generally when I'm playing small blind versus big blind, I'm going to want to play very aggressively. And when I am raising, I'm going to want to raise full pot in those cases. So now let's go to the replayer and pull up a few hands and show some examples of where we raise in early position. Alright, so in this example we got ace 3, 4, 7 under the gun +1, and this is one where I think I open for a min raise. So this is a hand where it's got some decent nut potential. I have the suited ace, and if I can get a 2 to flop, I have the potential to make a wheel or a nut low. So I think it's worth coming in for a raise with a hand like this. But then again, I don't want to bloat a huge pot out of position. I also don't want to give someone the ability to make a huge 3-bet on me and and put me into a tough decision where I have to make a call in a situation where now the stack to pot ratio is getting a little bit unfavorable for the type of hand that I have. And I'm not going to go through all the post-flop stuff in these hands. I just want to kind of go through here and show some of the pre-flop situations. Likewise, here's another one with a suited ace and a bunch of wheel cards where it's got a lot of good nut potential, and we also have this this poster back here. It's another one where I'm in raise. And so overall, I leave myself in a pretty decent position, and hit a reasonable flop there. So this is a really premium hand, and we are, 7-handed here. So this is one that I might normally just open for full pot. This is the kind of hand, if you have it heads up, you can just really hammer on people and put a lot of pressure on them. The downside is a lot of times when I do get called, it's going to be one of these folks, especially this guy back here that's playing 62% of hands, and so that's an argument against opening for full pot, but it doesn't mean that you can't do it. A lot of these pre-flop, I should point out too, a lot of these pre-flop styles, as far as whether you min-raise or raise full pot or raise full X, a lot of it's going to depend on your individual style, and you need to kind of figure out what works best for you. There's so I've gone through my database and looked at how different players play. There's quite a bit of difference amongst winning players in these games, and so you got to kind of find what works for you. I'm trying to frame the thought process that you should be going through as you make these decisions. And so here that I do elect to open for full pot. I don't think I have any 3-bet pots in this series of hands I'm going to show. Here's another one too with another hand that plays pretty well, heads up. And this is one where, so we like to come in for the full pot size raise and attack this rocky limper. So this is a guy only playing, we have a reasonable sample on him. He's only playing 15% of hands. He's only raising 3% of hands, which basically means he's raising his aces for the most part. And so if we can get this heads up, that's favorable. Although we have enough hand strength, if we do get called by some of these players back here, it's really not the end of the world. Although in general we don't have any super loose players. I mean, the loosest is this guy playing 37% of hands, which is, in my opinion, a good bit looser than what you want to play, but definitely not like some of the fish that you'll see in some of these games playing 60%. Yeah, and we do end up getting heads up against him, which is good, because even though his range, his limping range is probably ahead of us, or could be ahead of us, or pretty tight, we do have position, and we know that his range is super strong, and so we'll be able to play pretty well against him after the flop. And not to lead into the flop stuff too much, but it's a good board to see bet. So I'll show one more of these, and then I'll kind of move on so we can get to some more concepts. This is sort of bad aces, and a lot of times I think this is usually pretty easy to fold this, especially we got some looser players back here, and this is going to be tough to play out of position. This is one where I think I opened it, but I think that was kind of a mistake in this case. I think those aces you can fold. I do have a low draw, but it's a pretty bad low draw. I'd really want that 8 to be something lower, maybe 4 or something like that, before I get too crazy doing that. Alright, so those are some examples of when we might raise an early position. And so let's move on and talk a little bit more about what we do in late position. So here's where we really want to open up and play quite a few more hands. So the first thing to consider is what the previous action has been, and like I mentioned earlier in the video, we've already got limpers, or if someone's already open, don't really expect them to fold. So you might be able to isolate that player, but you're never raising in late position to try to take the pot down right there. If someone is already in the hand, you're going to be seeing a flop most all the time. And if 2 players are already in the pot, then it's probably going to be a multi-way pot more often than not. So the question is, do we want to get heads up or multi-way? And so sometimes we don't have a choice. Sometimes it's either we fold or we play a multi-way pot. But sometimes we do have the opportunity to give ourselves a good chance of getting heads up, and we can do that generally for the first ones in the pot, or if someone's already opened or min-raised, and then you 3-bet. If you 3-bet, usually get heads up most of the time. So the types of hands that we're going to want to try to play to get heads up are the hands with an ace and a wheel card and a big card, generally, like a ace-2 king, ace-3 queen with a suit, hands like that, where when you're heads up, what you usually, let me back up. So with those types of hands, what you generally tend to flop is a medium strength hand in both directions. It's hard to make the nuts in both directions with hands like that. But the thing is, when you have medium strength hands in 2 directions, it makes it really tough for people to scoop you. And so if you are heads up and in position, it allows you to play very aggressively. Whereas in the multi-way pots, you're going to have to make the nuts. in general to take the pot down. In Omaha, with everybody having 4 cards, the nuts are usually out there. So you need to have some nut potential to play multi-way, but heads up, you can have much weaker holdings. So, which is interesting because in some ways you may 3-bet some hands that don't play well at all. Multi-way, they might actually be a little bit weaker than some of the hands that you'll just flat with. So the other thing always to consider, of course, is the players on your left, assuming you're in the cutoff or the hijack, and how prone they are to call you. So if you got a maniac on your left, it's going to really shut you down. And depending on the table dynamics, it may make sense just to leave that table and move away and find a better spot if it's going to cramp your style too much, or if there are no other tables available, or you don't want to move, or maybe there's some other really bad players in the game, you may just have to deal with it and adjust your style and slow down. It's another good point on these pre-flop positional stats. These are going to vary really widely session to session depending on the players that you happen to have in the game and who's on your left and the type of game that it is. And then the other thing you always want to watch out for too are the stack sizes. If you've got a short stacker opens and then you 3-bet them, well, most of the time the money's going to be going in on the flop, or they're just going to jam on you and it's going to go in right there. So, you know, watch out when you're playing against short stackers, and if you play aggressively against them, if you're not willing to get it in with them, then you may just want to call, or you may want to fold, or not build too big a pot right then and there. So now let's go in and take a look at some of these hands that are played in late position. Alright, so here I've got not super great aces, but I am on the cutoff. And that actually folds to me a lot of times. If there was a limper, I would go after the limper and try to isolate them heads up. In this case, I'm just going to go ahead and open. I end up taking the blinds down, which is kind of rare. Usually, you do get some calls. So this is the kind of hand that's really good to play heads up. So we've got a suited ace, it's an ace forward, and we've got one Broadway card. It's the kind of hand where you're usually not making the nuts very often. To make a nut low, we need a 2-3 to hit, which aren't a lot of combos of that. And then to make the nut high, generally that's going to be the spade flush, which isn't going to come in a whole ton. Broadway is going to be pretty rare. But it is the kind of hand that heads up against one player plays pretty well. In this case, it folds to us, and so don't really get to ISO anybody. And here I raise for just 3 big blinds instead of my normal 3.5, and I'll do that quite a bit on the button, because usually people in the blinds, whether they fold or whether they call, tends to be not too dependent on whether you raise 3 big blinds or 3.5. So you just save yourself a little bit on those hands where you do get called. Alright. King, king, queen, queen, 2 big pairs, no suits. A hand that's not as strong as it seems. It's definitely much different hand value than if you're used to playing a lot of PLO, but it does have good strength, and we do have a good position, so this is something we're definitely going to be opening. So here's a hand with a bunch of middle cards, which generally doesn't play too well, but it folds to us here in the cutoff, and we've got a pretty tight player here, although we've got some pretty loose players in the blinds. And so with these loose players in the blinds, that's kind of an argument for just folding this. And then especially with this guy in the big blind, he's a very strong player. He plays a lot of hands, but he knows what he's doing, and he plays very well post flop. This was from the session I was trying to make for the video, and so I opened this mainly to try to get into some more interesting flop situations. But in general, this is, while a very strong PLO hand, not a super great PLO 8 hand, and it's going to be getting us into, a lot of times, into a little bit of trouble post flop, because it's just a case where if we make the nut high, there's a low possible, and then we can't scoop, and if we make a straight with no low possible, then we don't have the nuts, and it's just very tricky to play. Although the advantage here is we do have position, and with this guy playing pretty tight, most of the time we're going to be, if we do get called by the blinds, we're going to end up in position. So this was still a pretty loose open, I ended up opening it and everybody else folded. So here are more kind of junky aces, which in early position I would tend to be folding. But here I'm going to go ahead and ISO this guy. I think I end up heads up, yeah, which is good. If this was multi-way, like if all the blinds had come in, this would be fairly tough to play, even in position, since I'm never going to make a good low. It's hard to hit a flop too hard with this. Plus, if a lot of people do call you and you're in a multi-way, a lot of them probably have aces, and so it makes it tough to have a set of aces. And so in this case, I ended up getting heads up, hitting a nice high-only flop with an ace blocker or a flush blocker. So this hand, again, this is the last one I'll show for the raised hands. You know, pretty marginal, an ace 5-6 draw. I've only got a suit. I really don't have much going on with this hand. The best feature is the ace high flush draw, which isn't going to come in very much. But we got this guy who posted, and we have a little bit of history with him. He's playing 40% of hands, so he's probably way too loose and pretty weak. So even when we hit marginal flops, we're not going to hit any flops too hard. But this guy's range is going to be super wide. I mean, really, he posted and he checked, so this is like, it's not 100% of hands, because if it was stronger hands, he may have opened. So he's got pretty much garbage cards. So we can play pretty well against him if we can get heads up position. But he ends up folding. A lot of times these donks that just post don't like to just fold their posted blind, and will call with just about anything, and you can get yourself in some favorable position situations when you're in position. All right. So 3-betting, I want to talk about this a little bit more. I've been mentioning it kind of throughout the video. So in PLO 3-betting is something that a lot of players just flat out don't do. And other players do it some, but they only do it with their premium aces, which is a mistake, because generally when someone does 3-bet, it's so rare, unless you have some specific information on that player, like they're a good regular, you've got history with them, you know they might be tricky. Generally you can put them on aces. That's mostly take that to the bank with most players. Now, one thing that's kind of tough if you're looking at Hold'em manager stats and trying to figure out how people play, going back to your database, 3-bet percentage generally doesn't tell you too much. Obviously it tells you something, but it doesn't tell you too much, because so many players in this game don't open enough hands to begin with. You don't get as many 3-betting opportunities as you would in like Hold'em or PLO. So a lot of times you might have a very low 3-betting you can have a wider 3-betting percentage range, but an actual, let me back that up. So you can have a wider or a relatively wide 3-bet range, but still end up with a low 3-bet percentage, because if people aren't opening pots in front of you, well, then you don't get the opportunities to 3-bet. But I think it's definitely something you want to have in your repertoire. There are a lot of reasons why I think it's important to have a reasonable 3-betting range beyond aces, and one of it just is it gives us the ability to isolate donks. So when people do open, you can play pots heads up with them. And even when they have strong opening ranges, a lot of people won't 4-bet without premium aces, so you don't have to worry about getting 4-bet too much, although it obviously happens now and again. And the other cool thing is when you do this to isolate, they generally tend to give you credit for aces, and so you can play a lot of flops really well against people because they're perceiving you to have this strong range, and so on some flops you can take advantage of that perception where they're giving you aces and take the pot down where maybe you missed. And then on other flops that actually hit you, your hand will be somewhat disguised, and then you can win big pots that way. So, but isolating, getting heads up in position with donks is probably the biggest reason why we 3-bet. And then less of a reason is for value, where you have a big hand and you just want to get as much money in the pot pre-flop as you can, particularly when the effective stack sizes are shorter. One reason we don't 3-bet is as a bluff. Again, we're never expecting to just take the pot down pre-flop. So we're either trying to get the pot heads up, or we're just trying to get a lot of value out of our hand. We're never trying to 3-bet super light you know, our range is going to extend beyond aces, but we're not going to do it with random garbage to try to take them off of flops, because it's just not a good idea. People hit flops too often and they never fold pre-flop, and so you may do it with some weaker hands, but you're never going to do it just with an air ball. But it makes sense. And already covered, you know, opponents usually have ace-ace, so if you're facing a 3-bet, it's most of the time going to be aces. And so even though usually, let's say you open a hand, especially something like king, king, 2, 3 or something like that, you're going to be way behind aces generally, but the thing is, you know what the other player has, and so you can play them very accurately post-flop, and a lot of times your hand will be a little bit disguised and you can take down some big pots when you crack aces. Because the other thing is, when people 3-bet when they have aces, now the pocket's kind of big, they don't generally like to fold them, and a lot of times they'll concoct all sorts of reasons to continue in the hand when maybe they shouldn't. Alright, so now I'm going to pull up some examples of some 3-betting hands, which I don't have a whole ton of them in here, but we'll see. So this first hand here, I got ace, queen, queen, 2 on the button. It's a pretty strong hand. It's a good one to play in position. So this guy who's uber tight, only opening 3% of the hands, he's probably got aces. I like to go ahead and 3-bet him here, and generally this is kind of a sketchy 3-bet because he's going to have aces based on his range. We've got 100 hands, which is a reasonable sample. He's only raised 3 of them, basically, so he's probably only raising aces here. The problem is, if he 4-bets, then we've got kind of a big problem here. So, but generally most of these tight players, when they do open, they tend to be pretty reluctant to put in a 4-bet. So in general, I'm not going to be too concerned about getting 4-bet. And the other thing notice here too is my 3-bet sizing is I don't bet, in this case I don't bet full pot. And the reason for that is I think a lot of players, when you 3-bet, they don't necessarily recognize the difference between a full pot size 3-bet and a smaller 3-bet. It just registers in their brains that, wow, this guy 3-bet, and nobody ever 3-bets, and if they do, they have ace, ace, deuce, 3 double suited. That's usually the thought process. So I think you get the same effect by raising a lower amount. And here he actually does 4-bet, and so this is a case where I really need to fold, because if I call this, there's going to be 50 some, 52, 53 in the pot, and the effective stacks are going to be 65, so he's going to have a little bit more than a pot size raise left, and so I'm going to be in bad shape. Post flop. So, but this is one in that session where I was making for the video, and so I was trying to play as many hands as I could. So I actually called this to kind of see what would happen, and I end up flopping my nut low and my overpair queen. So really, I mean, this is about as good a flop as I can hope for. The only next best thing would be like if that 6 was a queen or something like that, and I could crack his aces or something. But in general, this is as good as it is, and so with their stack to pot ratio being pretty small, we're going to end up just going with this hand. So if he bets, we're going to get it in, and if he checks, we're just going to go ahead and pot into him and try to give him a chance to fold out the high half of the hand. But I'll repeat that I should have folded to the 4-bet at that point. So we get it in, and he shows up with the old trip aces. This is fairly annoying because anytime you have trips, it's pretty bad. Even the 3 aces with the deuce, to 4-bet that, I think is just, I don't know. I think that's a little much. I don't really like the 4-bet there with that kind of hand, because you're just not going to hit too much. But he ends up having like the perfect hand to just crush me and end up quartering me here. So, but again, the key play there was to fold. I think the 3-bet was good because most of the time we're going to be able to play him pretty well post flop. But you know, I just called kind of for the sake of the video, and it cost me a little bit. So here's one where this really fishy guy opens, and so he's playing 53, 18, and so that's a great guy to get heads up in position with. Our hand is nice and nutty. You know, we got the ace high suit, we got another kind of backup flush, and then the 1, 2, 3 low draw, and then everybody to our left. This guy's pretty loose. These guys are super tight, and so when we 3-bet, more than likely we're going to end up heads up with him, and this guy is pretty short anyways, and so even if he comes along, we really don't care, because if we 3-bet and he calls, he's going to be all in, and so he's not really going to factor into our post-flop play too much. And so again, I raise a 3-bet, and he ends up calling, and so we leave ourselves in a pretty nice situation overall. So here's a hand with not a lot of high potential. We've really only got the suited ace, but again, this guy is pretty darn fishy overall, and we've got some this guy's pretty loose aggressive, but this guy's really tight. This guy's super tight. I mean, 9-2 over a couple hundred hands, and this guy 14-2, so I'm not really worried about these guys coming in the pot unless they have something big. And this guy, even though he's a pretty aggressive player, I mean, if there's a 3-bet, if he's facing a cold 3-bet and he's out of the small blind, if he plays, his range is going to be super strong. I mean, that's going to be like an aces situation. So even though in general this guy having position on us, we're going to want to be a little bit careful in this situation with him and the blind. I'm really not too worried, because if he 4-bets or something, depending on how many people come in the pot, if we end up heads up, we can just sort of give it up, and we end up getting heads up against the donk again, which is a good situation. You know, had we just not 3-bet and just called, you know, a lot of times you're going to get other people coming in, and now we're going to have this big multi-way pot, which isn't the worst thing in the world with this type of hand. But whenever you get the opportunity, especially in a 4-ring game, to kind of get isolated against a bad player, you like to be able to do it. I think a lot of people, when they play 4-ring, they kind of resign themselves just to playing like 4- and 5-way hands, because they limp all the time, and the reality is you don't have to do that. There are situations where you can get heads up. So this is like the epitome of a good hand to have heads up. You get the ace-2 draw and the ace suit, the Broadway cards, and it's just really hard for one other player to scoop you when you've got a hand like this. And so here you actually get a limp and an open, and so we're going to go ahead and 3-bet, and we're going to end up with a pretty big pot here. This guy plays a pretty tight range, which is actually an argument for not 3-betting him. Let's see this hand. I ran some weird filters, and so these hands are kind of from all different sessions. So it's actually from last fall, but he's a very tight player, but he's a very competent player and knows what he's doing. So given that he's raising such a small percentage of hands, and that's usually aces, that makes the 3-bet a little bit less attractive, because he can put us in one of those situations where he 4-bets. It doesn't mean we're going to fold, but it's kind of an awkward spot. So we actually get this call from the grinder rock, which is interesting, which means that his range must not be as strong as we thought, because for him playing 13-1 to cold call a 3-bet, he's got to have something pretty good, which is weird as well too, that he didn't 4-bet, right? Because when he's playing 13-1, he's got to have a really strong range to come in for 3-bets cold. But if you've got that stronger range and someone's 3-bet, well, then what you really want to do is just jam and 4-bet, and then the flop just plays itself. You can just get all the money in without having to think. Whereas by cold calling here, he's either doing something really weird with a weak hand, or he's setting himself up to make a bad decision. He's giving himself the opportunity to make a bad decision on the flop. The other reason why I hate this cold call is this guy, who's probably got a pretty strong range, if he does have good aces, well, he's just going to jam the money in at this point. So I don't recall what happened in this hand, and we hit a dream flop, so can't ask for a better flop than that. So at this point, money's going in. He flats again. That's the weirdest thing. They actually, oh, that's interesting. He's actually got equity. So anyways, kind of, I don't know, kind of a weird play. I mean, I guess I see what he was doing. I mean, he did have a really strong hand with the ace-2-3 and double suited. But in general, calling 3-bets cold is not a super terrific idea. And we chop up. Oh wait, we don't chop it up. Okay, we get quartered. Whatever. So that's 3-betting, and then I think I'm going to wrap it up for this video. That got me through all the pre-flop stuff that I had. I've also got some other flop stuff which I will cover in the next one. So that's it for now. Please leave me feedback in the forums or send me a message and let me know what you liked and what you didn't like, and also let me know what you want to see in future videos. My current plan is to delve a little more into flop play, and also looking at how I'm also going to have some other videos on how different pre-flop hands fit different flops, and be looking at the equity distributions that we flop, and basically how often we flop a certain equity percentage in different situations, and how that might affect how we try to manipulate the size of the pot pre-flop. And then when I get back into the flop stuff, I'm going to be talking a lot about flop texture, and I'll be getting into when to c-bet and when not to c-bet in a lot of gory detail. I know there were some requests in the forum for that kind of stuff, and I was hoping to cover a little bit of that in this video, but I'm at, I think, 46 minutes or so right now, and if I open up that can of worms, I won't be able to get very far into it in this video, so I will be covering that next time. So in the meantime, this was Dan Deppen for Card Runners, and I'll see you later.